The sky here's very strange. I often have the sensation when I look at it that it's a solid thing up there, protecting us from what's behind. From nothing, I suppose, just darkness, absolute night. That's written by Paul Bowles from his book, The Sheltering Sky. It's an incredibly important book to, to many people, especially people who've traveled outside their country to remote lands. It's about people who are going to far places and having experiences that could edify them or destroy them. I I wanted to have a reading copy of the book because I like to read it when I'm on trips. I've read it many times, and I found this wonderful old, I think this is an early 60s paperback that makes it look like a crazy romance novel, but it's a very important piece of literature um, that was important to many generations of travelers and backpackers. And I think it was particularly important from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Uh, People on the hippie trail, the backpack trail, The Sheltering Sky was one of the books that was part of the Bible of people who wanted to travel like that. I'll read another passage from it here. A lot of famous quotes from it. Whereas the tourist generally hurries back home at the end of a few weeks or months, the traveler, belonging no more to one place than to the next, moves slowly over periods of years, from one part of the earth to another. Indeed, he would have found it difficult to tell, among the many places he had lived, precisely where it was he had felt most at home. So in The Sheltering Sky, we have two characters, Kit and Port, and they're in the desert in North Africa, traveling about. And sometimes when we travel, we think we're finding ourselves, but maybe we're really trying to lose ourselves. Uh, Maybe we think it's a joyous thing that we're traveling, but maybe it's because we hate ourselves. And this is very much part of the book of The Sheltering Sky. I know I was sort of motivated to make this video because I heard about people who said, well, uh, they had a hard time understanding the characters' motivations. And in a lot of really good literature, they don't just say out in a couple sentences what that is, but you should be able to understand what it is. These are people who have some internal hatred or loathing or lack of ambition or drive to do something. And so they head further and further out to the ends of the earth, um, again, thinking they're going to find themselves, but maybe just going to lose themselves. Death is always on the way, but the fact that you don't know when it will arrive seems to take away from the finiteness of life. It's that terrible precision that we hate so much. But because we don't know, we get to think of life as an inexhaustible well. Yet everything happens a certain number of times, and a very small number really. How many more times will you remember a certain afternoon of your childhood? Some afternoon that's so deeply part of your being that you can't even conceive of your life without it. Perhaps 4 or 5 times more? Perhaps not even. How many more times will you watch the full moon rise? Perhaps 20? And yet it all seems limitless. This is part of the realization, the introspection I think we get from travel, to take ourselves outside of the routine of our lives, to challenge ourselves. Um, and it's certainly a book. It's not a long book. It's a book I don't know if people read that much anymore, and if they do, I don't know that they're reading Paul Bowles, but he's fantastic. This is a definite book. If you're interested in traveling to far places, the psychology of it, you need to read that book. Again, it was required reading that every backpacker had in their backpack and read when they traveled to far places. I always like to, you can read it in 2 or 3 days. I always have a copy or a printout of it, like especially when I go to Laos, still kind of a very remote place. I always plan out and read about a third of it every day I'm there. It's well worth it. Paul Bowles is a great person to look into. His short stories are excellent as well. A Distant Episode, and the other one is Delicate Prey. And I believe the collection of his short stories is called A Distant Episode. They're also about losing yourself, losing your mind, incredibly weird debauchery at the end of the world. I think when these were written, maybe in the 50s, they seemed kind of sensational. But now we can get past that, and we can see some of the psychology when you put this a person from one culture into a far-off place of another culture. And that place is Morocco. There's another book called A Dream at the End of the World. If you're interested in people who the artists who lived in other places, A Dream at the End of the World is about Paul Bowles and his wife. They're both authors. There's Jack Kerouac is in there, John Huston, the director, Truman Capote's there, a lot of different, Ginsberg I think ends up there as well. Dream at the End of the World. It's subtitle, A Portrait of Paul Bowles and the Literary Renegades of Tangiers. Definitely worth looking into. And here's the last quote I'll read from it, maybe convince you to read it. Someone had once said to her that the sky hides the night behind it, shelters the person beneath from the horror that lies above. Unblinking, she fixed the solid emptiness, and the anguish began to move in her. At any moment, the rip can occur, the edges fly back, and the giant maw will be revealed. Again, that's Paul Bowles from The Sheltering Sky. Get a copy and read it if you're interested in travel, the psychology of travel, and the psychology of remoteness.